Hey everyone, imagine this. You're invited to this like breathtaking rooftop party, but the thought of even looking down sends shivers down your spine.
Right.
Or maybe a quick elevator ride up to your office on the 10th floor suddenly feels like you're like scaling Mount Everest.
Yeah.
Sound familiar? Today's deep dive takes us straight to the edge, exploring the often misunderstood world of acrophobia, the fear of heights.
And you know just how deep this dive is going to be with this like stack of medical studies and research you've given me.
Right.
We're going way beyond just like a mild case of the heebie-jeebies here.
Absolutely. It's about unpacking why some people experience sheer terror at heights that others barely even notice. So let's start with the basics here.
Okay.
What exactly are we dealing with when we talk about acrophobia?
So we're talking about a specific phobia, officially recognized in the world of mental health, and it's more common than you might think. But this isn't just about feeling a little uneasy on a ladder.
Right.
It's an intense, irrational fear that can trigger full-blown panic attacks and completely overwhelm someone's ability to function normally.
Okay, so we're talking next-level stuff here.
Yes.
But what's fascinating to me is that this can happen even when someone is perfectly safe.
Right.
Like intellectually, they know they're not going to plummet off a balcony, but their body reacts as if they are about to. What is going on there?
That's one of the things that makes acrophobia so intriguing.
Right.
Imagine this. Your heart starts racing. You feel dizzy, maybe even nauseous.
Oh, wow.
All because you're near a window on the 3rd floor.
Wow.
For someone with acrophobia, even the anticipation of being at a height can set off these like intense physical symptoms.
Wow. So it's like their body is stuck in fight or flight mode.
Yes.
Even when there's no real danger.
Exactly. And it goes beyond the physical.
Okay.
Imagine dreading social events, avoiding certain places, even organizing your life around not encountering heights.
Wow.
All because of this intense fear.
Yeah.
It can be incredibly limiting.
It sounds utterly exhausting.
It is.
So what causes this extreme reaction? I've always wondered if there's an evolutionary component to it.
Okay.
Like, did our ancestors who were a bit too bold around cliffs just not pass on their genes?
That's a theory that definitely holds weight.
Right.
Picture our ancestors navigating a world with plenty of perilous cliffs and heights.
Right.
It makes sense that those who are naturally wary of these environments would have had a survival advantage.
Right.
Their caution would make them less likely to, shall we say, have a tumble.
Right.
And more likely to pass on those cautious genes.
So maybe acrophobia is like an ancient safety mechanism hardwired into our DNA to keep us from falling out of trees.
Possibly, yeah.
Makes sense, but I'm guessing it's not always that simple.
You are right on the money. Like most things in psychology, it's rarely just one thing.
Right.
While evolution might lay the groundwork,
Right.
we can't ignore the whole nature versus nurture debate.
Of course not.
Some people are genetically predisposed to anxiety disorders, while others might develop acrophobia after a negative experience, like a bad fall.
Right. It's that age-old question. Are we born with it or do we learn it?
Right.
I'm sensing a pattern here when it comes to the brain.
Yeah.
There's rarely a simple answer.
And here's where it gets really interesting. There was a study where researchers found that children who experienced minor falls when they were learning to walk were actually less likely to develop a fear of heights later in life.
Hold on, that's wild.
It is interesting.
So experiencing a fall early on might actually make you less afraid of heights.
It would seem so, yeah.
How does that even work?
The researchers believe that those early stumbles, which are usually pretty harmless, actually help young children calibrate their internal danger radar. It's like their brains learn through experience that falling doesn't always equal disaster.
Right.
They learn to better understand their limits, their balance, and how to react in those situations.
So maybe a little bit of controlled exposure, even if it's a bit scary at the time, can be beneficial in the long run.
That's what it seems to suggest, yes.
I wonder if that applies to other fears as well.
That's a brilliant question, and one that researchers are still exploring.
Right.
This particular study highlights just how complex the interplay of genetics, personal experiences, and even those early sensory experiences can be in shaping our fears and anxieties. It's not as straightforward as we once believed.
Right.
Right?
I love how this deep dive is already challenging so many assumptions.
Wow.
We've talked about evolution, personal experiences, but what about the role our brain plays in all of this?
Sure.
It all seems to come back to how we process the world around us.
You're spot on. The brain is the command center for all of this.
Right.
Research suggests that acrophobia could be linked to how our brains process visual information and balance.
Oh, yeah.
Two things that are obviously crucial when you're dealing with heights.
Of course, yeah.
Our brains rely on multiple senses to determine where we are in space.
Right.
Our inner ear for balance, feedback from our muscles and joints telling us where our body is positioned,
right,
and of course, our eyes.
So it's like all these different senses are sending information to our brain.
Yes.
Kind of like a constant GPS signal, helping us make sense of our surroundings.
Exactly.
Okay.
And for most people, when visual cues become less reliable, like when looking down from a great height,
right,
their brain automatically starts relying more heavily on those other senses to compensate.
So you might feel a bit unsteady, but your brain goes, don't worry, I've got this.
Right.
We're not actually falling.
That's a great way to put it.
Yeah.
But for people with acrophobia, there seems to be an over-reliance on those visual cues.
Interesting.
And when those cues get distorted or overwhelming at a height, their brain struggles to reconcile the conflicting information.
Right.
And bam, that's when those feelings of dizziness and fear take over.
Wow.
Yeah.
So it's almost like their brain gets stuck in a feedback loop.
Right.
Fixated on those visual cues, even when they might be misleading.
It's like that, yeah.
Wow.
And there's another layer to this.
Okay.
And research suggests that simply moving sideways at a height, even if the height itself doesn't change,
right,
can trigger a stronger fear response than just like standing still.
Interesting.
It really highlights how complex this interplay is between our senses, our brains, and our perception of heights.
That makes sense. It's like your brain is saying, wait, things are moving, but we're not on solid ground.
Right, exactly.
Okay, so we've uncovered some of the science behind this. But how does someone know if they're dealing with a full-blown phobia or just like a healthy dose of caution?
Right.
How do you even diagnose something like acrophobia?
That's a key distinction.
Right.
And it's not as simple as disliking tall buildings.
Right.
For it to be a true phobia,
yeah,
it has to tick certain boxes.
Okay.
We're talking about fear and anxiety that are persistent, present for at least 6 months or more, and significantly impact your day-to-day life.
So we're not just talking about getting butterflies in a glass elevator, right?
Right.
It has to be interfering with how you navigate the world.
Exactly. Think about it. Constantly turning down invitations to rooftop gatherings.
Oh, yeah.
Meticulously planning commutes to avoid bridges or overpasses.
Oh, yeah.
If these kinds of avoidance behaviors start dictating someone's life,
right,
impacting relationships or even their job, it's a clear sign we're dealing with more than just like a mild aversion.
That really clarifies things.
Yeah.
So let's say someone listening realizes, okay, this is not fun anymore. This fear is actually holding me back. Right. What can they do about it? Are there effective treatments for acrophobia?
Absolutely. The good news is that acrophobia is very treatable.
Okay, good.
And there are some incredibly effective therapies out there.
What, like what?
One of the most common and successful approaches is exposure therapy.
Okay, so facing your fears head on.
Yeah.
I have to admit, even hearing that phrase makes my stomach drop a little.
Huh.
How does that work exactly?
It sounds intimidating, I know.
Yeah.
But the key is that it's done very gradually.
Okay.
And always under the guidance of a trained therapist.
Of course.
They wouldn't just throw you off the deep end, so to speak.
Right.
They might start with something simple, like having you look at pictures of tall buildings or watch videos of people hiking in the mountains.
So easing into it, letting your brain dip its toes in the water before, like, diving right in.
Precisely. It's about gradually increasing the intensity of the exposure over time. As you progress, the therapist might introduce more challenging scenarios, always ensuring you feel safe and have coping mechanisms in place.
Right.
The goal is to rewire those fear responses.
Right.
Showing your brain that heights don't have to equal danger.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
But I imagine it still takes a lot of courage to confront those fears head on.
It can, yeah.
What about those of us who might not be ready for that level of intensity? Are there any other options for treating acrophobia?
Here's where technology enters the picture, and it's really quite remarkable.
Okay.
Remember how we talked about the brain's reliance on visual cues?
Yeah.
Well, virtual reality technology is now playing an increasingly important role in treating phobias, including acrophobia.
I've heard about this. It's like virtually tricking your brain into thinking you're actually at a height.
That's a great way to put it.
Yeah.
With VR, you can experience those triggering heights in a controlled, completely safe environment. Imagine putting on a headset and finding yourself on a virtual bridge or a skyscraper rooftop.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
It feels incredibly real.
Right.
Your brain is convinced, but deep down, you know you're not in any actual danger.
That's incredible. So you get the benefits of exposure therapy.
Right.
That gradual desensitization without the logistical challenges.
Right.
Not to mention the fear of actually being suspended hundreds of feet in the air.
Exactly. And the research on VR therapy for acrophobia is very promising.
Yeah.
Studies are showing that it can be just as effective as traditional exposure therapy, and in some cases, even more so.
Really?
Plus, it's generally more accessible and affordable for many people.
This is amazing. It's like technology is giving us these new pathways to overcome our fears.
It is.
But what about those of us who might not have a full-blown phobia but still get a little wobbly at the top of a ladder?
Sure.
Any advice for handling those everyday encounters with heights?
You're talking about what's often called visual height intolerance. It's just that unsettling feeling many people get when looking down from a height, even if they don't meet the criteria for a clinical phobia.
Right.
And you're right, it's incredibly common.
Yeah.
The important thing to remember is that it's a spectrum.
Okay.
And there are things you can do to manage those feelings.
So it's not about aiming for this state of being utterly fearless, but rather finding ways to cope and navigate those moments when they arise.
Exactly.
What are some of those techniques?
One very effective technique is to focus on a fixed point in the distance.
Okay.
This helps to stabilize your visual field and reduce that sense of movement that can trigger anxiety.
Right. It's like giving your brain a stable point of reference.
Yeah.
So it's not as overwhelmed by the feeling of being up high.
Exactly. Another helpful trick is to try sitting down instead of standing.
Oh, God.
It sounds almost too simple, but lowering your center of gravity can make a world of difference.
Right.
It can help you feel more grounded.
Yeah.
Literally. And ease some of that anxiety.
Okay, I can see that. Sometimes the simplest solutions are the most effective.
Absolutely. And of course, never underestimate the power of your own breath.
Right.
Deep, slow breaths can do wonders for calming your nervous system and bringing those physical symptoms under control when you start to feel that surge of anxiety.
It's amazing how such a basic physiological function can have such a profound impact on our mental state.
Yeah.
It's like hitting the reset button on your brain in those moments of panic. You know, what I find so empowering about all of this is that it really reframes how we think about fear.
Okay.
It's not about being scared or not scared.
Right.
It's about understanding what's happening in our brains and bodies and learning tools and techniques to navigate those experiences.
You hit the nail on the head.
Yeah.
Understanding the science behind these seemingly irrational fears can be incredibly liberating.
Right.
It allows us to approach them with more compassion for ourselves and a greater sense of agency.
Absolutely. So to anyone listening who might be struggling with acrophobia,
Yeah.
or any fear for that matter, remember this. You're not alone.
Yeah.
And there's no shame in seeking help.
Absolutely.
There are incredibly effective treatments and coping mechanisms out there that can help you live a fuller, less limited life.
That's right. Knowledge really is power. And sometimes simply understanding the why behind our fears is the first step towards overcoming them.
Well said. It seems we've officially scaled the heights of acrophobia for today, haven't we? Any final thoughts for our listeners before we sign off?
You know, what I find so fascinating is that something as seemingly simple as height can trigger such a powerful and complex response in our brains.
Right.
It makes you wonder, what other hidden anxieties might we have lurking just beneath the surface? Anxieties that might benefit from a little deep dive of their own.
That's a thought-provoking question to leave our listeners with.
Yeah.
This deep dive into acrophobia reminds us that our brains are constantly learning, adapting, and yes, sometimes even misinterpreting the world around us.
Right.
But with a little curiosity and a willingness to understand the science behind our fears, we can start to unravel those anxieties and live more fulfilling, less restricted lives.
I completely agree.
Thanks for joining us on this journey into the fascinating world of acrophobia. We'll see you next time for another deep dive into the mysteries of the human mind.